Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. Okay, Capitol Hill was absolutely nuts this week. The good news, a government shutdown has been averted. The bad news, name calling, kidney punches, a near fist fight in the Senate, and a Republican member of Congress who the Ethics Committee says should be investigated by the Justice Department. What on earth? Joining me now, Washington Post congressional reporter Mariana Sotomayor. Mariana, welcome back to First Look.
Thank you. What a
So,
time.
yeah, what a time to be alive. So, the deal to keep the government open, we're going to get the serious stuff out of the way first. The deal to keep the government open finances roughly 20% of the federal government through January 19th, and the remaining 80% until February 2nd. So they've kicked the can down the road to early next year. How likely, though, is it that the House will be forced to pass appropriation bills that originated in and passed out of the Senate on a bipartisan basis?
That is the big question. And listen, I've been talking to a lot of House Republicans, and they know that this just tees up an incredibly difficult fight for January and, of course, February, where by February we can see a complete government shutdown. This new two day, two tier, however people want to describe it, approach is actually pretty significant for Mike Johnson, the new speaker. It was his proposal, kind of blending and compromising what House Republicans really wanted. But again, even though Republicans were able to pass it, it completely irritated the far right, who have now put Johnson on notice for all of these fiscal fights that will be coming up. Of course, the Senate passed this deal because they said, why not? We don't want to see the government shut down, even though this is a weird two-tier approach. But right now, there's only a couple weeks in December, of course, before the Christmas holiday, and only several weeks until that first January 19th deadline. And what Republicans, Democrats want to see are House and Senate appropriators meeting, discussing, and trying to create these compromise bills that the Senate has already more or less marked up in a bipartisan basis. We just haven't seen that happen in the House. So, even to your point, if the Senate were to pass a significant number of their appropriation bills, it ultimately comes down to Speaker Johnson. Does he put those compromised bills on the floor? And what does the far right do? We have already seen Johnson decide to kind of circumvent the far right's demands because they were going to sink the short term extension funding bill. He said, we're going to try and pass this in a different way with the help of Democrats. A bipartisan solution. That's why you see the government funded now. But that far right, when they get mad, we've seen what they've been able to do in the past.
Right. And so on that point, because as you pointed out, Speaker Johnson has been able to avert a government shutdown by doing the same thing his predecessor, Speaker McCarthy, did, and that was rely on Democratic votes, a lot of Democratic votes. So you say the far right has put Johnson on notice, but are there rumblings that Speaker Johnson could very well meet the fate of now former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, even before we get to that first of the two-tier deadlines?
So, not yet. There is a marked difference of how the Freedom Caucus and a number of other far right members view Johnson. They very much understand that he came into this job with only 3 weeks until that government funding deadline. So they knew they likely wouldn't get what they wanted. However, they wish to have seen Johnson incorporate more of their demands, which were way more spending cuts, even though the Republicans are already addressing that through the appropriations process, funding border security. Those discussions are ongoing. And listen, when I've talked to a number of those members, they will say Johnson is honest. He does not lie to us. And that is a personality difference from McCarthy, where many members know that even if he made a promise, he wasn't going to keep it. But again, to your point, McCarthy and Johnson literally just did the same thing. Introduce a bill that funds the government at current fiscal levels for just a couple more weeks and have Democrats help to pass it. That is exactly what triggered the motion to vacate for McCarthy, but it wasn't strike one. So some Republicans say what Johnson just did is strike one, kind of hinting, that a couple more strikes and he could be out. I actually tried to ask McCarthy about this, pointing out a bit of a double standard by the far right, and it was actually seconds after he had elbowed punched Tim Burchett. So I did not get much of an answer from McCarthy. He kind of just shrugged at me, kind of like it's just another day.
Well, let's talk. Good. I'm glad you brought up the kidney punch because you had a story this week about stunning lack of decorum at the Capitol, with McCarthy being accused of elbowing Republican Congressman Burchett of Tennessee, while Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma challenged. Now this is chutzpah, challenging the president of the Teamsters to a fight while while Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, was a witness at a hearing, a Senate hearing. Has everyone lost their minds up there? Up there, is this the new normal?
I hope it's not the new normal, but ever since I've started covering Capitol Hill, something that you hear is members of Congress, whether it's Senate or the House, should not be in session for more than like 6 weeks. The moment that you cross that threshold, you're already probably thinking someone's going to get yelled at, hurt, something. So the fact that the House had, in particular, been in session for 10 weeks, I was not surprised to see the fireworks start to go off. And many people on Capitol Hill were thinking, oh my gosh, everyone leave. Even Speaker Mike Johnson said, members have got to go. We got to fund the government because this place is a pressure cooker. And that he had no idea that seconds before Burchett and McCarthy kind of got into it. So, you hope it's not the new normal, but this is not the first time we have seen things like this happen. And it's unfortunate. Honestly, after January 6th, we've seen many more confrontations among House members in particular. And I will say, you ask reporters who have covered Congress much longer than I have, and this idea that of partisanship, right? We shouldn't be working with the other side, seeing the other side as the enemy. That has only emboldened some members to just have these confrontations. And that is not good. It's obviously not good for policymaking, finding consensus, but it really is demoralizing to many members. And I would not be surprised. We've already kind of started to see it on the House side, the number of retirements that we might see after the holidays, because a lot of members are going to be going back, talking to their families and asking, is this worth it? Is it worth it for me? Is it worth it for us?
Um, George Santos, Congressman Santos of New York, the ethics report that came out had a lot of words in it that I never thought I would see in, ever. Botox, Hermes, Ferragamo, OnlyFans. I mean, folks, just go read the ethics report, Mariana. What is the likely? Now, Congressman Santos, almost immediately after the ethics report came out, he put out this long thing on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And way at the bottom, he makes the big announcement that he will not seek re-election in 2024. My question to you is, will George Santos be one of those people who comes back from the Thanksgiving break and announces, actually, I'm leaving now?
I would maybe think so, because if he doesn't say, I'm resigning effective immediately, Republicans and Democrats in the House are going to take him out. There was this question earlier this month about expelling him because his New York Republican colleagues are so over him that they actually introduced that resolution. And the House Ethics Committee actually kind of inserted themselves into the conversation by announcing that they would release their report by today, November 17th. They obviously released it yesterday. That was to help a lot of Republicans and also Democrats who had concerns that Santos still hadn't gotten due process. Because if they were to have expelled Santos, and if they expel him next month, he will be the first lawmaker in the House's history to have been expelled without having actually been convicted of a crime. Obviously, we know he's under investigation, But there's just so many things that he has done. And even for the ethics committee to say it wasn't worth even talking to him because we knew that he was not a credible witness because he lies all the time. I mean, there is just so much, I guess, annoyance with Santos, whether it is Republican or Democrat, that we have already heard from a number of Democrats. They will be introducing privilege resolutions to expel Santos. But most notably, it must have just happened at the top of the hour when the House was going to convene for a pro forma session. Michael Guest, he is a Republican and also the chairman of the House Ethics Committee. He was expected to introduce a resolution to expel Santos. And that's significant because usually when it's the chairman of the ethics committee, not to mention of the same party that holds the majority, we've already seen a number of Democrats and also some Republicans who said, I stayed out of the fight earlier this month. I voted against or I voted present to expel Santos, now saying that they will do it. So if Santos doesn't come out and resign himself, the House will take him out.
And I did see, I can't remember where, he apparently, Santos announced he's giving some kind of press conference on the steps of the Capitol on November 30th. So maybe that will be his swan song high C moment. I don't know. Washington Post congressional reporter Mariana Sotomayor, as always, thank you for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thanks and happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Same to you. Now, we're going to keep the conversation going with our Opinions Roundtable in just a moment. Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post Associate Editor Ruth Marcus and Washington Post columnist Max Boot. Ruth, Max, welcome back to First Look.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm sorry to start on the unserious, well, compared to the Israel-Hamas war, but Ruth, since you wrote a column about Congressman George Santos, let's pick up where I was leaving off with Mariana. You have a column with the headline, "Shame Isn't Working, George Santos Must Go." It is in the physical edition of the Washington Post today. My question is, hasn't the level of lack of shame been in short supply in Washington, and particularly at the Capitol, since the Trump years?
And perhaps before. I mean, I think we've seen over the years the sad experience and sad demonstration that if you can just brazen your way through a tough period and some bad headlines, you can manage to survive it. And so the absence, George Santos is the current avatar of the complete absence of shame. And I apologize for this whiny dog in the background.
It's our extra correspondent.
But while we're talking, this is Augie. He has no shame because he is begging for treats right here, and I have no discipline, so I'm giving them to him. But back to Santos. I mean, he is the absolute epitome of the absence of shame. But I think that this is one of those astonishing and unfortunately rare instances where, as Mariana was saying, the facts, the unavoidable facts, are going to catch up with him, and even his own colleagues, at least enough of them, I believe, are going to vote to expel him if he doesn't have the good sense to leave on his own of his own accord.
And Max, you wrote a different column, but I think, pulls out 30,000 feet from what Ruth's very specific column is about. And you wrote, "While we continue to obsess about external threats, particularly from Russia and China, the biggest menace we face is our own political dysfunction." Explain.
I mean, I think this is the larger issue that we face as a country. It's much more the challenge that comes from within rather than the threats from without, whether it's Russia, China, what have you. And this George Santos situation is kind of a minor comical example. I mean, it doesn't really get at the real issue, I think, which is, I mean, of course, there have always been grifters, and Santos is obviously a grifter. I think the real problem is the ideological division, the gridlock, the partisanship, the animosity, and fundamentally the fact that so much of the Republican Party has swung so far to the right that it makes it very hard to get anything done in Washington. You see that, for example, with Tommy Tuberville continuing to hold military officers hostage. They can't get confirmed. That's leading to a readiness problem among our armed forces. You also see it with the fact that Congress is still not able to approve funding for Israel and Ukraine, two allies that are in the middle of wars that need our support. But their causes have been subsumed to these larger partisan struggles in Washington. And I mean, fundamentally, most of my column was really focused on foreign policy and national security. What's fundamentally disturbing to me is that for the first time since Pearl Harbor, you have a substantial isolationist movement in the United States, which is hostile to America's leading role in the world, to the foreign policy and the trade policy we have followed since 1945. And I think ultimately that may be our undoing, much more so than any external threat.
Max, let me just stick with you because, as we all know, President Biden met this week with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Biden described the talks as, quote, some of the most productive and constructive discussions we've had. Were they, Max?
I do think that they are productive and constructive within certain narrow parameters. I mean, it's not like we're going to talk away our fundamental underlying disputes with China. I mean, China wants to take over Taiwan. We don't want China to take over Taiwan. So those kinds of issues, they're certainly not going to go away. They're not going to be resolved in discussions. But I think, it is important to have discussions between the leaders of the world's most powerful countries. And they have shown some small progress on issues like restoring military talks, or talking about AI, or other issues. So simply the process of discussion, I think, is very helpful in limiting the scope of disagreement and reducing the chances of an accidental conflict, which are very real given the ongoing confrontations between US and Chinese naval vessels and aircraft all over East Asia.
Let me follow up with you, Max, because with the Chinese economy in a downward spiral, with deflation, high youth unemployment, slow growth, was President Xi on weaker footing with President Biden than it might appear to the casual observer?
Absolutely. I think there has been a noticeable change in Xi's behavior towards the West. He has kind of put wolf warrior diplomacy on the shelf. You might say he's kind of neutered the wolf warriors, because right now China is undergoing their greatest period of economic weakness in decades. They're having a hard time recovering from COVID. And part of their issue is they're hurting because foreign investment is leaving. They're hurting because of the export controls the Biden administration is putting on semiconductors and high-tech goods. So for his own domestic tranquility, Xi needs a better relationship with the United States as well as with Europe, which are two of China's biggest trade partners. And so I think what you saw is a much more accommodating Xi than in years past, when he felt like the East is rising and the West is falling, which has been a popular Communist Party slogan in recent years.
And Ruth, so when President Biden was asked if he still believed President Xi was a dictator, here's what he said. Listen.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours.
What do you make of that, Ruth?
I was really glad to hear that. The instinct of politicians is always to try to not be rude to the people that you've just met with, to kind of soft pedal the differences. And I think that I was glad that President Biden was willing to call a dictator. And I thought this was a very good week for the president in terms of foreign policy. And I would really braid together the two episodes that we watched this week, the humiliating spectacle of various things going on in the House, though I would say that the movement to rein among his colleagues to rein in Senator Tuberville is like another good illustration of things going right, in addition to George Santos. But we see these follies of adolescent behavior, and I'm really insulting adolescents here, on the House in Congress, whereas we saw two mature superpowers who are adversaries on many levels dealing with each other in responsible, serious ways in the summit meeting with President Xi in order to ameliorate and avert bigger problems, and to recognize, as we did during the Cold War in dealings with Russia, that we need to find ways to avoid escalation and to coexist. And I thought it really underscored for me how um, big a change things could be between President Biden on the one hand and the prospect of a future President Trump dealing with China on the other.
So Ruth, help me out with something, because it was just last month that President Xi emphasized what he called a growing, quote, political mutual trust with Russian President Vladimir Putin. What are we to make of, given that, what are we to make of the positive signs coming out of that Biden-Xi meeting you were just talking about?
I think it's Xi wants to have it multiple ways. He's certainly not the only dictator or only world leader who wants to have things multiple ways, but he recognizes, for some of the reasons that Max laid out earlier, that he needs to manage both relationships simultaneously. The very complex relationship with Russia and Putin on the one hand, and perhaps the even more complex relationship with the United States and, for now, Biden on the other hand.
One more question on this before we move to Israel, Hamas, Max. Does Russia's experience in Ukraine these last 18 months make a China move on Taiwan less likely?
I think it does, as long as the West stays the course. I mean, if we buckle now and cut off Ukraine, and I should note that aid to Ukraine is running out and it needs to be approved by Congress by the end of this year, or a lot of people are going to die in Ukraine, and that blood is going to be on the hands of those Republicans who blocked that aid. But assuming that we do approve the aid and keep Ukraine as a functioning nation, and Russia does not achieve its design of taking over Ukraine, I think that does send a message of deterrence to China that it won't be so easy to take over Taiwan.
Ruth, switching now to the Israel-Gaza war, President Biden said this week he's mildly hopeful the hostages taken by Hamas into Gaza may be released. He also said that he is deeply involved in those talks, and that's great. But should we worry that the president doing so raises the value of those hostages for Hamas?
This is the constant tension that leaders and particularly presidents deal with when they're trying to mediate between the absolute moral and emotional imperative of getting hostages returned and not incentivizing hostage taking down the road and raising the value of hostages. I think in this circumstance, with women and children, with old people, with the horror of this having gone on for so long, and in particular with the fact that American citizens remain held hostage, the president really needs to do and bring to bear what America can bring to bear in terms of getting the hostages released. I think all of at least some of them. I think the signs are positive for at least some interim, partial, inadequate, but still very much hope for agreement. It's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to watch those hostage families on TV. My heart just breaks at each one of them.
And Max, the Israel-Gaza war continues. And this week, President Biden said it will not end until Hamas is dismantled. But is that realistic?
I think it is a realistic goal to dismantle Hamas control of Gaza. You can't necessarily eradicate the entire organization or destroy its ideology, but it is certainly possible to break its hold on Gaza in the same way that we helped to destroy the ISIS caliphate. That is certainly a possible goal. I think that is probably going to be a goal that Israel will eventually achieve, but it's going to be a long and bloody conflict. It's already a long and bloody conflict. And, Jonathan, I've just been talking to some retired Israeli generals this week who are basically saying, don't get your hopes up for an early into this war. We're still in the early days. I mean, one general estimated it could take another 6 months of fighting in Gaza.
Did those generals happen to say to you what they believe is the next step, like once the war is over? As I'm still waiting to hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu about what comes after for Gaza.
Well, I think much more clear for them is what the tactical next step is, because it's pretty clear that with the Israeli Defense Forces having secured most of the northern Gaza Strip, they're going to have to pivot south and try to deal with the Hamas brigades that are located in the south. But in terms of what comes after the fighting, I think everybody's crystal ball is pretty murky, and you're getting very mixed messages from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who on the one hand is saying Israel doesn't want to reoccupy Gaza. On the other hand, Israel, he says, will have a continuing security presence in Gaza. So it's very hard to know what to make of that. I think perhaps one possible end state would be something like what prevails in Area B of the West Bank, which is an area where the Palestinian Authority has political control, but Israel still has substantial security responsibility. So I think something like that may be a possibility, but it's really hard to know how we're going to get there, because Netanyahu remains, and his right-wing coalition partners remain, very hostile to the Palestinian Authority, which is the only realistic alternative to Hamas in terms of ruling Gaza in the long run.
Ruth, we have less than a minute left. I'll give you the last word on this.
Well, you asked about whether it was feasible to dismantle Hamas, and I think as difficult as that is going to be, and I guess it depends on what you mean by dismantling, I think it's the remantling, if I may, the ability of Israel and the region to find a structure, if not a governing structure, a continuing mechanism for Israel to protect itself against a future October 7th and a repeat of October 7th. Given that Netanyahu, as Max said, has done his absolute best to neuter and make the Palestinian Authority ineffective, dismantling is going to be the least of it. Finding a mechanism for governance and coexistence going forward is going to be the really hard part. And I agree with Max. We really haven't even begun. Israel hasn't begun to lay out what that is going to be. And it is going to be so difficult.
Yeah. And with that, we're going to have to leave it there. Ruth Marcus, Max Boot. Max, I want those two gray chairs behind you over your over this left shoulder. Right. Have a great
Talk
weekend.
to me offline.
All right.
Jonathan, I'm leaving it to you to turn First Look into a shop up.
Have a nice weekend. Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about next week's interviews and to register. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.